Man in Gray here with another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is The Wars of America by Robert Leckie, published in 1998 by Castle Books. It's 1,281 pages. Robert Leckie was born in 1920 and died in 2001. He was a writer of popular military histories. But it didn't start out that way. And the backstory behind how this book got written is kind of interesting. So I want to take just a minute and tell you a little bit about Robert Leckie's interesting life. He started out as a journalist in college, and then when World War II broke out, he joined the Marines in 1942 and spent the war fighting in the Pacific. He was in the Battle of Guadalcanal, and he was seriously wounded in the Battle of Peleliu and was shipped home, where he was discharged honorably in 1945 at the end of the war. After that, he became a reporter for the Associated Press. But something happened in 1951 that completely changed the course of his life. He was asked by his wife to go see the new Rodgers and Hammerstein musical, South Pacific, and so he agreed to take her. But Leckie had a different reaction to South Pacific than the vast majority of people. He was horrified by the way the war in the Pacific was portrayed in that musical. He was so upset that he told his wife, "I have to tell the true story because people think this war was like the musical." And so he spent several years writing his memoir, which was finally published in 1957 under the title Helmet for My Pillow, and it became a bestseller. And that book, years later, after Leckie's death, was one of the source materials for the HBO miniseries The Pacific. In fact, Leckie's one of the characters in that miniseries. The success of Helmet for My Pillow led Leckie into writing a whole series of popular military history books. He wrote books about the American Revolutionary War, the American Civil War, World War II, Korea. He also wrote a history of the Catholic Church of the United States. He wrote several novels, and he wrote a whole series of history books for young people. But this book, The Wars of America, is his magnum opus. In this book, he gives short surveys of every war fought by the United States or the American colonies from the French and Indian War until the Persian Gulf War in the late 1990s. Like I said, he wasn't a trained military historian, but he was a very engaging writer, and he really knows his stuff. As you go through each chapter, they're all laid out in the same basic format. He starts out with a background to the war, what was going on politically between various countries that led to the war. He gives short biographies of the major military figures in the war. He talks a little bit about the battles. He doesn't spend a whole lot of time going into details about the battles. And then he goes into more detail about the aftermath of the war and the political effects of it. Now, I found that the chapters in this book on the lesser-known wars are the most interesting. He was particularly good in the Mexican War, explaining, because the Mexican War is one that's difficult to understand, and also the War of 1812, another war that was rather complicated and ended in kind of a stalemate. And also, I think the chapter on the Spanish-American War is really good, and he follows it up with an almost completely forgotten American war, the War for Philippine Independence. After we defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War, we seized the Philippines. And then immediately there was an insurgency against the United States because they wanted their independence. And so he goes into that in quite a bit of detail. Now, if you're already, you wouldn't be reading this book unless you were interested in U.S. military history. So if you're reading this book, or you're going to read this book, you're probably already going to know a lot about World War II and the American Civil War and the Revolutionary War. And so you're not going to learn anything new there. As I read those chapters, it was all just, review. I'd already knew all that stuff. So I find that the lesser-known wars, the wars I didn't really pay much attention to, are much more interestingly told. The book does kind of come off the rails a little bit at the end when he gets to Vietnam. Now, Leckie was a political conservative, nothing wrong with that, but he did, I think, when he got to Vietnam, he did let his politics kind of bias his reporting or his history of that war. He promotes the dubious trope that the war in 1973, when the U.S. forces pulled out of Vietnam, the war was almost won when we pulled out. That if we'd only stayed 6 months or another year, we would have completely defeated the North Vietnamese. And the reason we pulled out, the reason America turned against the war, the reason why most Americans turned against the war was a combination of hippie protesters and a liberal biased mainstream media. This is the same trope that Senator John McCain repeated a lot during his career. Now, the reason I say that's dubious is it completely ignores the fact that over 300,000 Americans were killed in that war and thousands more were wounded. There was the American people saw these deaths and they're saying, well, how are we making any progress? Especially after the Tet Offensive in 1968, it became clear to a lot of people that this was going to be a long, drawn-out war and we may not be able to win it. And also, by the early 70s, the economy in the United States was being affected by the spending on the war. Inflation started going up, our budget deficit mushroomed, and of course, the opposition to the Vietnam War wasn't just in the United States, it was most of our allies were opposed to us fighting over there too. So there were a lot of reasons why Americans eventually turned against the Vietnam War, aside from just protesters. I would argue, and some historians agree with me, that the hippie protesters really didn't have that much influence on public opinion. The other issue, and we know this now because of declassified documents from the Lyndon Johnson administration, Johnson's military advisors were warning him as early as 1964 that the war in Vietnam was not going to be winnable by military force. The only way we could win was to negotiate with the North Vietnamese. And the reason for that was the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong saw this war as a war of independence. They saw it as trying to free themselves from foreign occupation, first the French and then the Americans. And there was no way they were ever going to give up. They were determined to expunge the United States from occupying Vietnam. Also, the Chinese and the Soviet Union were supplying them with military weapons, an endless supply of weapons. And the only way we could have stopped those were to bomb the bases in China. And neither Johnson nor President Nixon was willing to do that because there was a real risk that it would have escalated into a nuclear war. And nobody wanted a nuclear war over Vietnam. So it became pretty clear as early as the 60s to these advisors that we weren't going to be able to win the war just by fighting. And so that's an issue I have with Leckie on Vietnam. The other issue is with the last chapter of the book, which deals with the Persian Gulf War, the war to kick the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. Now, in a lot of ways, the Persian Gulf War was the perfect war for America to fight, if there is such a thing. There were very few American casualties. We had specific goals. We wanted to kick the Saddam Hussein and the Iraq army out of Kuwait. We wanted to reestablish the Kuwaiti government that had been there, and we did both of those. The war was mostly fought in the desert, so there were very few civilian casualties involved. And the Kuwaiti government in exile paid for the war. So this is one of the rare times where the United States didn't have to borrow money to fight a war. The issue, though, that Leckie doesn't really deal with here is whether we should have been fighting that war at all. Now, Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, murderous, brutal dictator. He repressed his people, and he invaded Kuwait without provocation. It was a bold, nakedly aggressive imperialist war. But the Kuwaiti government was also an undemocratic, repressive government. So in the past, the United States has always said we're fighting, when we go to war, we're fighting for democracy and freedom. In this case, we were replacing one dictatorship with basically another. And it's pretty clear that the primary reason we went to war to free Kuwait was to maintain the status quo as far as the oil industry in the Middle East. So we were fighting war over oil. Now, you could argue that that's a legitimate threat to the United States. We wanted stable oil, but that's something that Leckie doesn't even bring up in here. The book ends on a note of triumph. The book ends with the Persian Gulf War. The United States won a massive victory. It restored Americans' belief in the military. It restored American prestige around the world. And of course, that was about the same time the Soviet Union was collapsing. And so the United States emerged as the only superpower in the world. Now, Robert Leckie, as I mentioned before, died in 2001. He suffered from dementia toward the end of his life. So he didn't live long enough to see the two other wars that started after that, the two longest wars America's ever fought, the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, both of which initially were victories. We defeated the Taliban in Afghanistan and we overthrew the Saddam Hussein government in Iraq. But in both cases, there were insurgent wars that broke out afterwards that we were never able to completely conquer. We were never able to wipe out the Taliban or the Ba'athist Party insurgency in Syria or in Iraq. And we basically, those wars basically destabilized the entire Middle East and allowed Iran to become powerful. And of course, while that was all going on, China was emerging as a second superpower. So while this book ends optimistically, I think if he'd lived a few more years, he might have had a different conclusion to the book. Now, all the caveats that I brought up about Vietnam and the Persian Gulf War aside, this is still a really good book to read, especially if you haven't studied military history very much. The chapters are quite well, some of the chapters are longer than others. Most of them are around 150 pages or so. The chapters on World War II are longer than the Civil War, but they're really well written. And Leckie was a very engaging writer, a very good popular historian, and so I really recommend The Wars of America if you're interested in American military history, with the caveats that I mentioned. The book is The Wars of America. The author is Robert Leckie, and this has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.